When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be doing a character analysis of Visenya Targaryen. I've done this a little bit in the past, but I wanted to fully expand upon this, give my full thoughts on the character, as she is one of my favorites as I've reread Fire and Blood throughout the years. I think she's one of the most complex. There's so much to speculate with the character. She's one of the most loved and hated characters within Westeros itself, not the actual community. Some people think that she was this sorceress that used like blood magic and things like that, and she did all these horrible things like killing Aenys and prompting a lot of the violence that Maegor would do. But then some loved her. She commanded the loyalties of people like, say, the men of Cracklaw Point. We even see that brought up in A Feast for Crows. So Visenya is a very complex character because she, on one hand, inspired loyalty from a lot of different people, but at other points, she only inspired fear. And so we're going to go through the character and see what is so important about her life in shaping the early Targaryen dynasty, not just within her brother's reign Aegon's, but also the reigns of both of his sons, and Aenys and Maegor. So Visenya Targaryen was the eldest of the three children. A lot of people kind of forget this and think that Aegon was the eldest, but actually it was Visenya. If the Targaryens had done Dornish law, Visenya would have been the person set to inherit, for instance, taking over the Iron Throne. She would have been the actual ruler. Now that isn't the case, and I think for a lot of reasons that wouldn't have been done anyway, just given the fact that when we see Aegon's conquest, he very much tries to fit in to Westerosi culture while also keeping the air of like, we are better than you to some degree, but just not as much as Visenya would say put in Maegor. Like, he tried to fit in by having a sigil made, having house words, things like that. And so if Visenya had been the person that the Targaryens tried to put on the throne, the Targaryens would have gotten even more pushback. And would people have bent the knee as quickly? I don't think so. Like, for instance, would the Starks have bent the knee to a woman? There's a lot of prejudice against a woman ruler. How would that have gone down? And so we're not really going to speculate too much on it, but it is fruit for thought, just given the idea that Visenya is the oldest of the three. Now, Visenya had very Valyrian features. She had the classic long silver gold hair, often braided, bound in rings. She had the purple eyes, so she was the classic Targaryen beauty, more or less. But there was something a little bit different about Visenya. For instance, her sister Rhaenys had like the more classical Targaryen beauty, like just being described more kind of like maybe like Rhaenyra in her younger years as being the realm's delight. Visenya wasn't that. Visenya had a beauty about her, but it seemed to be like a dangerous and wild beauty. It's very interesting because it kind of reminds me of Lyanna in a lot of ways, if, well, Lyanna was a Targaryen, but that's the way I look at Visenya. Visenya was not somebody that had that stereotypical womanly beauty. She was more described as being stern, serious, unforgiving, but yet also passionate and sensual. So Visenya is quite unique, especially when you look at women in this society. I mean, think about how many women in Targaryen history or even in Westeros history are as fearsome of a warrior as Visenya, who have the personality of Visenya, of this outspoken, determined woman that you just don't see in this culture because it's just put down. Women are not raised to be like that. They're raised to be more like Sansa than, for instance, like Arya or Visenya in this case. Visenya would also bond with the dragon Vhagar, who would have a few mounts throughout the years and be one of the most influential dragons throughout all of Westerosi history and Targaryen history specifically, just given the fact of not only the dance, but during the conquest as well. It's also worth noting the reason that we also look at Visenya's beauty a little bit differently in terms of how Rhaenys was viewed is that just the way that Visenya dressed. She didn't always dress in, say, fine dresses or silk. It was just as equally that she would dress in ringmail. So that was something that was also unheard of. Think about the way that Brienne is viewed for dressing up like as a knight, for instance, how she's discriminated against. Now, Visenya would not be the same whatsoever. Brienne is kind of a younger girl and she doesn't stand up for herself the most. Visenya would not have been like that. She was very outspoken. And also you got to remember, the way Brienne is looked at, Brienne is discriminated not only because she's a woman, but also because she's not an attractive woman by the standards of what people around her judge her as. Visenya is not that. So Visenya is quite attractive while also being a warrior. So it's not exactly the same. And also you just have the idea that the Targaryens, especially during this era, Aegon's conquest, and a little bit further when the dragons are still alive, the Targaryens are viewed as gods. They are not judged the same as normal people like, say, Brienne. But in her early life, she was born on 29 AC to Lord Aerion Targaryen and Lady Valenna Velaryon, and she would have two siblings following after her in Aegon and Rhaenys. She was trained at arms with Aegon from youth and became a skilled warrior. Now, this is interesting because we don't see this custom passed down. After Visenya, there really are no like warrior Targaryen women, more or less. Like you have the Targaryens that have similar personalities to Visenya, most notably in Rhaena, in the Queen of the West, the child of Aenys and Alyssa, as we'll see a little bit later. But outside of that, like there's Rhaenyra, she kind of has that fiery personality as well, and you kind of see it every once in a while, but there's nothing like this, where Visenya also, outside of having the fiery Targaryen personality, she was also a warrior as a woman, and some people even think that she was better than Aegon, which I don't know. I think the issue comes with, like, Aegon was built bigger than Visenya, so it would come down to how skilled Visenya was with a blade versus the physical advantages that someone like Aegon would have. They both had Valyrian steel swords, so it is an interesting, like, match who would have won in a fight between Visenya and Aegon. It's also interesting to think, like, what allowed Visenya to be a warrior? Like, did her parents allow for this to be a thing? Because we don't see this passed on to the Targaryens in the future. So, like, what was the reasoning here? Was it a similar situation to, say, maybe Arya or Brienne, where they just grew up wanting to fight, to be a warrior? That was in their personality, and maybe her parents begrudgingly allowed this, or just, allowed it in general, and that just happened. I don't know. We don't really have any context as to Visenya growing up, but I think it is a similar situation to maybe something like Brienne or Arya. In her youth, though, she would take visits with her brother Aegon to the Citadel and also House Redwyne in the Arbor with Aegon. We know these trips very much seem to be about learning about Westeros, especially when we look at Aegon and his invasion. He wanted to know more about the country, right? Like, who were the people he was going to eventually try and conquer? He needed to know more about them. And this inspired things like, for instance, his epic, like, map table that he has made of, like, all the landscapes and the castles and all this stuff in Westeros. A lot of this was probably built upon on these trips. We also know that Visenya would marry her younger brother in Aegon, and this did not seem to be a marriage that was built upon love or even the two liking each other a lot. This seemed to be straight duty. So, for instance, like, Stannis marries Selyse out of duty, not because he loves her or anything like that. That seemed to be with Aegon and Rhaenys. Rhaenys and Aegon's marriage seemed to be more about actual love/lust. So it's interesting that Aegon is somebody that takes two wives, because this wasn't necessarily normal with the Targaryens. Yes, in the Valyrian customs, this was acceptable, but even think about, say, Visenya's parents. Like, her father, Aerion, only had one wife that we know of. So it is interesting, Aegon decided that love won out. He wanted to marry both of his sisters. Now, he probably didn't want to marry Visenya, but he wanted to marry Rhaenys regardless. So he has two sister wives. Now, that's a really interesting dynamic, because you would think, what does Visenya think about that? And from what we can tell, I don't think Visenya minded it all that much. I actually think Visenya probably liked it, because it allowed Visenya not have to bearing all the responsibilities of bearing children for Aegon. Now, we know that she would in the future, but I think it was more this idea that, like, Rhaenys took the burden off of Visenya being like the lovely wife to Aegon and all that kind of stuff. Like, Rhaenys fulfilled that role. And I think one thing that really pops out between the dynamic of all three of the siblings was Rhaenys was, I think, the glue of the three. So that when Rhaenys dies later, you kind of see how the deterioration of that family goes. I think that she was that glue. And it's really interesting because when you think about Aegon as a character, he's much more seen as like the middle ground. Like, he had parts Visenya and Rhaenys in him. You can see that there was influence from both of his sisters. Visenya kind of represented the more action-oriented side of Aegon, the more, using your power and the fear factor, and possibly at times cruelty and war. Like, that side of Aegon was present in Visenya. She is very much that side of him, and you see that in the way that she raises Maegor. Rhaenys was much more on the side of, like, on counseling Aegon on, I think, more how to rule the Seven Kingdoms. Like, for instance, we hear this idea that Rhaenys was somebody that was big on songs. And Rhaenys very much is someone that built up the I would say, legend of the Targaryens. The reason that the Targaryens were loved by so many at this early point, even though like they probably hadn't even met them or had only seen their dragons maybe for a little while, was because of her understanding of how to kind of mass manipulate the public on a similar level to, say, the church, for instance, and the faith. You know, songs are very important because you don't have the internet, you don't have all these things that can help travel information and stories. And so, for instance, the reason Aegon is going to keep Harrenhal in the state that it's in is as a sign. You know, if you go against the Targaryens, this is what will happen to you. It's kind of the same idea of like what Tywin does with him putting down his rebellions. So kind of went on a little bit of a tangent there, but it's all very interesting to explore in terms of the dynamics between Visenya, Rhaenys, and Aegon. So then this will get to the conquest for Aegon and his sister wives. This would begin by them sailing from Dragonstone and setting foot on Westeros, and Aegon beginning the Aegon Fort. Visenya would do a number of different campaigns during the conquest. She would start by doing the Crownland campaign, which something that's really interesting is you see how Visenya is quite smart. She doesn't like completely destroy House Stokeworth or anything like that. She burns the roofs and shows it as a warning. This is only a taste of my power, and gets them to subdue. She also takes control of Duskendale's riches to fund the war effort as well. She is present during the coronation of Aegon as she places the Valyrian steel circlet on Aegon, and she would take part in more or less leading the campaign against the Vale. And I think it's interesting the way that Aegon divides his sisters. So, for instance, in terms of taking the Vale is obviously probably one of the hardest jobs you could have. Because of the defensible position of the Vale, because of how difficult it would be to take, how massive of a fleet that the Vale would have in terms of rivaling the fleet of Aegon at this point with the Velaryons, you can definitely tell that Aegon prioritized Visenya, who is much more of a warlike general, to go to the more dangerous position. Whereas, like, yes, Rhaenys also has a tough thing that she has to do with going against House Targaryen and the Stormlands. I would say that Visenya had the more difficult job, the more dangerous job as she goes to the Vale. Now, the situation in the Vale would not necessarily go well for Visenya. The errant fleet would destroy a bulk majority of the Targaryen ships, but Visenya would kind of equal out the battle as she descended with Vhagar and burned the errant fleet right back. So you kind of had this stalling happen at this early section of the war where it was neither a victory or a defeat really for either side. Both took massive losses, and there was no real decisive victory. But before Visenya could finish up with the Vale and trying to subdue it, she was called to other places. She goes to Cracklaw Point, and here she gains more submissions, and even gets basically her own men to swear to her. We even see this once again in A Feast for Crows, with really the Cracklaw men being loyal to Visenya, being Queen's men. It shows that people were also inspired by her. People were willing to be loyal and follow her. It wasn't just completely fear. People also loved Visenya. She's very similar in terms of description to Daemon the Rogue Prince. People both feared and loved him, which is what makes him such a great character. The same is also true of Visenya, especially in her younger years. The next notable event for Visenya would be the Field of Fire. She would take place in helping win that battle. She's even known to have said that it was better that the Lannisters met them on the Field of Fire than having to go to Casterly Rock. She wasn't even sure if they could have taken it. And so you see that the dragons are loosed, about 4,000 men die, but we also see, I think, Aegon quite obviously doing some targeting against House Gardner, in which basically the entire family was killed in one day. This also meant eventually the Lannisters more or less bending the knee to the Targaryens as well. Visenya would take an injury, an arrow in the shoulder, but this would not be that big of a deal, and she would recover. Later, after Torrhen Stark bends the knee at the Trident to Aegon, Visenya would continue her campaign in the Vale. But this time, she seems to have learned a bit. She seems to have learned from, I think, both her brother and her sister in terms of how she can deal with the Vale. You don't always need to win every battle in combat. Sometimes just showing your power and your fear factor, more or less, and even a little bit of kindness, I would say, can help you gain a kingdom without fighting. And so she ends up going to the Vale, but when Shara Aaron, the person ruling the Vale at that point, found Visenya landed in the courtyard after Ronald Aaron is offered a ride on Vhagar, and even more importantly, like, she was kind of using him as a hostage, more or less, but she was also saying to Shara Aaron, I can do this whenever I want. I can come up to the Eyrie with Vhagar and completely kill everyone here. But why do that? Why not just have peace? And Ronald became, well, a vassal, a lord, no longer a king. So that gets us through most of Aegon's conquest. Now, there is really one big war left, and that is the First Dornish War, and this would change Visenya's life quite a lot, because Visenya, I think at this early point, she seemed having both good and negative qualities to her, but after the Dornish War, she would never really be the same. But I also do want to point out the rumors of Visenya being like a sorceress or dabbling in poisons really wouldn't start until around Aenys and Maegor's reign. But it is important to understand, like, that really starts to come up because of how Visenya's attitude changes, how she seems to kind of deteriorate as a person. And I think she and Rhaena, the Queen of the West, are very similar in that regard. They have a lot of tragic things happen to people close to them. So during the First Dornish War, Visenya would take part in this, but at this we would see something terrible happen to Visenya. She would lose her sister in 10 AC as Rhaenys was killed in Dorne. Visenya and Aegon were deeply destroyed by this. They would retaliate by doing a lot of, I would say, war crimes, doing a scorched earth policy, burning pretty much everything in Dorne. It's one of these moments I look at Dorne and go, there's a lot of plot armor here, but you can tell that the glue between Visenya and Aegon was gone. The two were, I think, devastated by Rhaenys' loss. I think it also plays into how the war would actually end in terms of the letter that was sent to Aegon. But it seems like that glue there, that warmth that kept them together, seemed to be dissipated after this. There would also be bounties and assassins that would be potentially used on Dornish lords. The Dornish would respond with cat paws, and there was even an assassination attempt in King's Landing, but this was cut down by Dark Sister. Visenya was too good of a warrior for things like this. Twice she defended Aegon with Dark Sister, and in one incident, she actually formed the Kingsguard. She more or less was trying to tell Aegon that he needed better warriors around him for things like this, like assassins, and even cut him faster than any of his lazy guards could stop her, and this more or less started the formation of the Kingsguard. So that's one thing that we overlook, I think, with Visenya is Visenya had a lot of smart ideas. She did formulate a lot of rulership policies that Aegon would put in place, but again, a very smart idea is when she puts the Kingsguard vows in place, she models them after the Night's Watch. And why is this so important? Because when you're in the Kingsguard, the most important part about being the Kingsguard is protecting the king and their family. That's what comes first. You should die for them. You should have no other moral obligations in terms of your own family or having your own children, anything like that. Your king and their family comes first. It was a really important model that Visenya put in place. But in 13 AC, the Dornish conflict would come to an end. But this would very much come to the displeasure of Visenya, and I really believe the thing that fully ripped the two apart in Visenya and Aegon was the ending of the Dornish War. Because in Visenya's mind, I can never see her ever backing down until the Dornish bent the knee. If you think about the way that she parents Maegor, think about the way she's described and who she is as a person, there's no way Visenya would have ever stopped the war. And whatever was in that letter, I don't know if Aegon ever would have told Visenya what it was, especially if it was something along the lines of like Rhaenys died or was tortured or anything like that. I just don't think Visenya would have been told. And so I think this is that wedge that drives the two even further apart without their glue and Rhaenys, is that Visenya felt like Rhaenys' death was for nothing. You know, she died for no reason because Aegon never even conquered Dorne to begin with. But Visenya wasn't in charge. She was not the queen. But this would turn to a more pressing matter as we got into Visenya being a mother and kind of the governance of the realm. Visenya would share the day-to-day rule with people like Rhaenys and the small council. She played an active role in rulership. But after Rhaenys' death, there seemed to be a massive issue with the Targaryen dynasty. There was only one descendant for Aegon. Aenys' health was faltering after his mother's death, and it was rumored that Visenya was barren. Now, I don't think this is the case. I think it's very clear that Aegon and Visenya didn't really sleep together. They weren't really trying to have children. Is that to say that they never slept together? No, but I think it's more similar to like Stannis and Selyse, where like they did their duty, but that just never really resulted in children. And so I think that Visenya realizing the situation made it to where she knew like she had to have a child. She and Aegon had sex more and had Maegor. That's what I think happened. I think that Visenya saw the weakness and instability in Aegon's reign, and especially how Aenys is described as a child as being weak. That is something that Visenya is going to look at and go, we can't have weakness. The Targaryen dynasty is built on strength. That is one of the key and main things that Visenya believes in. But in 12 AC, Maegor would be born on Dragonstone, and I've talked a lot about this. I believe that Maegor, for the most part, was raised by his mother. This seems to be very clear just from the point of view of, like, we get this rumor, especially later in the reign of Aegon, that the two were never really seen together. If one was at Dragonstone, the other one was trying to get King's Landing going, or the Aegon Fort, or in the early time when it was still being destroyed so that the Red Keep could be built. The two were very much apart from each other, and it was always known that Maegor was at Visenya's side. I believe Aegon didn't really parent Maegor much at all. And I think Visenya just did not raise Maegor well, in terms of raising him to believe that he is above everyone around him, praising his moments of violence, and showing Maegor that the way he would be rewarded, the way that the world works, was by violence and nothing else. And Visenya, don't get me wrong, was able to temper Maegor and make him make better decisions. Again, Visenya had been ruling the realm alongside the other counselors, but she definitely didn't raise him the best. And Visenya also in 25 AC would give Maegor Dark Sister on his 13th name day, a very young age to be given the sword to. Another issue you'd run into is that Visenya, I think, was very concerned and always thinking about the legacy of their family. You got to remember, her sister died because of Aegon trying to establish the kingdoms, and she wants that legacy to live on. Now, I don't think she ever would have tried to kill Aenys or anything like that, but I think that she saw weakness in Aenys, and that worried her. Because if they just did all this stuff to conquer the realm and then they all die and pass on, and Aenys destroys the realm and the dynasty barely lasts even 40 years, I think that was a main concern. And so I think what Visenya was trying to do was not only get her son on the throne at some point, because she believed he was the true strength of House Targaryen. So she tries to, more or less, once Rhaena is born to Princess Alyssa, who would eventually become queen, and also Aenys, is marry Rhaena or betroth Rhaena to Maegor. Now, there was a big gap there, but that was what Visenya was trying to do. In 37 AC, though, Visenya's brother Aegon would die, and at this, Aenys would be crowned. During this moment, Visenya would publicly doubt Aenys' fitness to rule, as Blackfyre was given to Maegor, and even during the wedding of Rhaena and Aegon, when Aegon would be named the Prince of Dragonstone, and also would become the heir, something that Maegor had formerly been. Visenya was extremely upset by this, and in a lot of ways, Visenya was somebody that didn't really listen to the crown because it didn't have the backing to really do anything against her. She had Vhagar. As the faith militant would begin to, arise and all this kind of stuff, Visenya would tell Aenys, do action. Go to the Starry Sept, burn it down. Go to Old Town. Make your point known that when you go against House Targaryen, you will pay for it. Aenys wouldn't do any of these things, and even in Aenys' final moments, Visenya was the only person that was able to make him feel a little better even before he died. We're told that Aenys, when he fell back to Dragonstone after all the issues going down at King's Landing, it was basically lost. Aenys was not being helped by the Maesters. The Maesters could do nothing to make him feel better. I personally believe the Maesters were allowing Aenys to die. Visenya took over care, and instantly he started feeling slightly better. This wouldn't be the first time this would happen. Almost this exact thing would happen with Maegor, but just Tyanna was the person that helped Maegor, not Visenya. Some people believe that this was either done through sorcery, or even that she poisoned Aenys, even though he felt better for some reason. Again, I understand why people believe Visenya poisoned Aenys, just given Visenya's actions afterwards. But my clear question would be, if Visenya wanted to kill Aenys, why take over his care? He was already dying. The Maesters couldn't do anything, and he was dying. Why would Visenya then take over care of him? I just don't see a world where Visenya would intentionally kill her own blood and the only child that the sister that she loved had. I just don't see it. But I understand the perspective of why that happened. But Aenys would then die, and Visenya would bring Maegor back to Westeros and basically prompt him to become king. Visenya would back Maegor during his wars, and I don't really want to get into everything that Maegor did during this point because I talked about that yesterday. And Visenya is more of a background character. Maegor is not Aenys. Maegor acted. So we don't really need to talk about Visenya as much. Just know about what Visenya was doing during this point was she was really like the hand of the king to Maegor without having that title. So I do want to point that out. Now, Visenya, during the reign of Maegor, she would support him during his war efforts. She would end up going to Old Town to try and take it at one point, more or less. But Old Town did surrender, more or less, anointing Maegor as king. It wasn't like a surrender. It was more like the High Septon died, and then the new one was like, okay, we'll let Maegor do whatever because we don't want to die. Visenya would also lead war efforts of her own, kind of doing some burnings in the Riverlands with Vhagar, kind of similar to her Dornish campaigns, but she wasn't like an active player anymore. Maegor was the person in charge. Now, she would hold Queen Alyssa, her children Jaehaerys and Alysanne's wards on Dragonstone, but as the years would go by, in 44 AC, Visenya would grow thin, haggard, and at this point, she would die. Visenya would leave behind really a legacy of both chaos and also structure. She was the person that completely prompted Maegor, and yes, that saved the Targaryen dynasty. It also cost the lives of many people and the bleeding of Westeros. And so Visenya would be cremated, her bones and ashes would be laid with her husband and brother, Aegon the First. And so Visenya, in a lot of ways to me, when you look at her life, she's so complex to understand because she has good qualities and bad qualities about her, and we don't know everything about her. I think if they do an Aegon the Conquest show, I think the most interesting character of the entire show is going to be Visenya, if they do her right. Because Visenya is a character that is just ripe for giving us extra details into everything that she was doing. Because we don't have a lot of the full context for some of the things that she was doing. Why did she parent Maegor the way that she did? Was Aegon present in Maegor's life? Or did Visenya push Aegon away from trying to be in Maegor's life at all? So there's just so much here that I think is so fascinating, and I love Visenya. And for Fire and Blood, the best 3 to 5 characters for me are like, in no particular order, are like Maegor, Visenya, Rhaena Targaryen, the Queen of the West, Rhaenyra, and like Daemon. Those are like my 5 probably favorite Targaryens of that book. And as you can tell, a lot of them are kind of like the fiery Targaryens. They're just the more interesting Targaryens for me personally. But thank you guys all for watching. I hope you guys all enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.